In my time playing Last Epoch and making content for the game, which is a long time by now, one of the biggest questions that always gets asked every single time, always on the Reddit, always on the Discord, in my DMs, everywhere, over and over again, it's the same question. Can I play the game without a build guide? Do I need one to play the game? The answer is yes, obviously, that you shouldn't need a guide for your first playthrough, or any playthrough that is, for Last Epoch at least. A simpler a question, the more complex an answer will be for it, though, and this is no exception. There are a lot of factors that come to play here, and a few that you probably haven't even heard of. Hello, this is Dread from Epic Builds, and in today's video topic, we will be talking about the current state of Last Epoch in terms of difficulty, complexity, and the new player learning curve, and some of the more important answers to this question I mentioned above. If dives into Last Epoch or other ARPGs interest you at all, I'd suggest leaving a like on the video and subscribing to the channel, as that's the best way to see more of this while also supporting the channel in a way that is 100% free. Now, of course, I make a lot of builds, as you know. I've been playing this game for more than 2 years now, so I have a repertoire of guides at my disposal. So whenever anyone asks, I'm always like, sure, of course I'll help. And I look through them all and I try to hook them up with something they're interested in. Now, of course, because of this, I get this assumption all the time. It's dread. Of course, you want people to use a guide when you play Last Epoch. You've made almost half of them. Wouldn't it be great for business? You make all the guides. Wouldn't it be great because, of course, you make YouTube videos and, of course, they make money. Now, of course, I get this a lot. Actually, just recently, like the other day, I had someone in my DMs assuming this as well. And my retort to all of that, at least currently, is this is my passion project, not a job. I don't make enough for this to be a job at the moment. So, in theory, I don't make any money at all when I suggest someone one of my innumerable amount of build guides. And if I were to estimate it, to really be honest with you, it would probably be close to a penny at most. That's how YouTube ad revenue works, obviously. It's even less if you use ad blocker, which I highly suggest you do, because guess what? I use ad blocker as well. If you want to know the truth, I get very little, which is, of course, fine by me. I don't view this as a job. I view it as a hobby. If this was a business, I would be already filing for bankruptcy, or I would have done so like 6 months ago. People have it in their mind that if you're anywhere near successful on YouTube, or Twitch, I guess, that you're just going to be rolling in the dough, and every action they take is motivated by greed. If I wanted to make money on YouTube, I would be making wildly different kinds of content, and I wouldn't be making content on Last Epoch at all. After all, it's a very niche game and an already niche audience. Now, with that out of the way, we can talk about the subject in more detail. To answer the questions with a few words, you genuinely do not need a build guide, or any guide at all for that matter, for Last Epoch, or any game, technically. The in-game guide, you should press G, it's great, and most things in the game are notated properly. If you are an ARPG veteran and have a slight inkling of what you're doing, you will do wonderful and you will not have problems till you hit deep corruption or you end up having some problems with the tier 4 dungeon bosses. Now, the problem is, this is not the only kind of player that plays the game. Not everyone is a veteran instantly, and not everyone is going to understand the differences between more and increased percent damage, how armor works, and how important it is for late game, or how the end game monolith system works. There are people who are very busy. They work a lot, or they have a family to take care of, or both in most situations. I know a lot of great fathers in the ARPG sphere, and they somehow manage to get enough time to make and play Last Epoch or other ARPGs. But a large majority of them have no time at all, at most, like at least 4 hours a night. This means that they have no time to be fooling around, to be honest. If they mess up with the build and have to respec it, that's time out of their, busy day, and they really don't want that. They need results, and it's completely understandable for them to pilfer a guide on Last Epoch tools or YouTube and follow that. So they have an easy ride to endgame so they can enjoy the game. So in that situation, I would suggest 100% a build guide because they don't have the time to test all the builds like I have had time for and like a lot of people have time for. A lot of people don't realize this, but if you have more than 4 hours to play an ARPG like this, you have the free time, you are an exception, not the rule. A lot of people do not have time to do so. So they rely upon guides and people who make guides to help them along this process so that they can catch up with everyone else, so they can understand the game better and have fun like the rest of us. Now, because of this, I try to go about making my guides differently. A lot of guides in the ARPG space are simply put, just telling you what to pick without any explanation of why they're picking things or how. This is because they do not have the understanding of the game and couldn't explain to you why they thought putting lunge on auto numlock was a good idea, or why they chose to scale armor shred on a build that is primarily scaling bleed. Sadly, YouTube can make people rich, and since that exists, there will always be charlatans or bad actors. So this will always happen and exist. Like I said earlier, I don't make any money, but that doesn't mean other people won't be able to, especially if they completely disregard quality and disregard all of the knowledge you need to actually make these guides. In Path of Exile, this is a huge problem, especially in relation to sources that primarily exist to shill for RMT websites, or worse, people who just never spend enough time to understand the game and link faster attacks with your arc. Now, this is of course a big problem, so I try to remedy this by being different. So that's why I go out of my way to try to make my guides as detailed as possible. I try to give a decent bird's eye view in the first 10 minutes, then spend the rest of the video explaining the build in meticulous detail. This serves two functions. The intro is meant for people who don't want to play the build that I'm talking about, but still want to understand how it works and what mechanics are at play. There is a lot to learn in Last Epoch and other ARPGs currently, and I put a lot of that info in those first 10 minutes. So if you don't want a build guide, but want to learn how to make builds, watch that portion, as that will be the most loaded with information, and that's what most people do. Now, for the 10% of you who end up playing what I am, this is for you, the last part of the video. That's where I explain things in more detail so you can replicate my efforts easier. But this brings up a good point that a friend of mine champions constantly because it's very relevant for this discussion in this day and age of gaming. A guide is a guide. It's not a strict set of rules. If you try to copy exactly what I did in the video, odds are you will have an absolutely terrible time. I've seen it time and time again. The whole point of the guide is to teach you how things work. It's not a playbook for exact choices you should pick every single time. But a lot of people click on a video, steal a planner or a path of building, and then they fail with the build miserably because they didn't understand anything at all and just wanted to skip the learning process. And in any kind of like profession at all, if you try to skip the learning process, there will be disastrous results. If a person makes a good guide, then that means it will teach you about the game and its mechanic while you read it slash watch it. And I try to make mine do exactly that. A good example is recently in my Lethal Mirage Blade Dancer build guide, I was running a Throne of Ambition and trying to scale as much armor as possible for the sole purpose of being able to tank tier 4 Jurla's attacks. This is because I planned that build to farm Jurla, so all of my gearing choices and passives were focused towards that. For reference, I was using perfection stacks. This was giving me a very large amount of armor and glancing blow, but we lose them as soon as we get hit. And since I have no dodge, we get hit all the time. This is absolutely terrible while in the Monolith of Fate, and it would never be up, so it's an atrocious way of spending your points. Unless you're fighting bosses constantly. Then it's different. In a boss fight, you don't get hit nearly as often, meaning that perfection stacks are almost always at 10 stacks while you're fighting them and when you get hit. At that point, they become very, very useful. A lot of people, and by a lot, I mean a lot, were asking Dread, perfection stacks suck, you nerd, but then also complain about dying constantly to bosses. Everything requires context, and nothing is made inside a vacuum. Build guides are meant to fix this problem by providing context, but that doesn't stop anyone from just stealing a planner, then complaining about it afterwards. A friend of mine, Tenkiei, he makes a lot of Path of Exile videos, and sometimes he puts out a guide on what build he's playing. Recently, he was playing a Shield Crush Trickster with, of course, the usual package of Emperor's Vigilance and all of that. Now, he was trying to set up a very chonky setup. He was trying to be very tanky because the kind of content he was doing, Expedition, requires a tanky build because no matter what you do, no matter how hard you try, Expedition will always find a way to kill you. So being insanely tanky helps a lot in that situation. So he decided to shed off damage scaling so that he could focus on not dying to, of course, the expeditions. Because I'll be honest, who wants to die constantly, right? It sucks. And that's kind of why he set up his build that way. Now, recently, someone took his guide and was like, oh, well, I really don't like this version because it deals no damage, or at least in comparison to some other guides. So they, of course, stripped all their defensive layers and went full damage. And then, of course, just like clockwork, in a few hours, they were in the Discord complaining that they were dying constantly and not able to survive anything. And of course, thankfully, they finally realized that to deal damage, you need to survive after a bunch of conversation and explaining the concept to him, which is great. He actually listened. There's a lot of people that don't listen. Don't be like that. Understand that sometimes when someone makes a choice, it's because they have context and you don't. So, hopefully, with all of this and from these examples, this gives you a bit more context behind the question, do you need a guide to play Last Epoch? If you do not have the time, sure, I would heavily suggest you run a build guide if you do not have the time to learn and make your own build. If you do have all the time in the world, you're an RPG veteran, you have 8 hours a day to play, then you probably won't need a guide for Last Epoch, but of course, you're a very small percentage of people in a very large kind of melting pot of random people across the world. And I hope that everyone understands that and this video helps you reflect upon that. With all that being said, this has been Dread from Epic Builds, off to work on more builds. Bye.